following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained. The dense jungles along the Thai-Myanmar border have always been mysterious, harboring not only dangers from smugglers and wildlife but also stories whispered through generations of shadows that move on their own. Voices that call from the depths of the forest, and unseen eyes watching from beyond the trees. For Sergeant Niran and his unit, it was supposed to be a routine 4-day patrol land assignment like many before. Their mission? To monitor the dense border region for illegal crossings and ensure national security. But what began as a standard operation soon unraveled into something far more terrifying. The early morning sun cast pale beams of light through the thick jungle canopy as Sergeant Niran adjusted his gear. His team of 4, including Corporal Vishai, Private Somchai, and Lance Corporal Aru, prepared for what seemed like just another assignment. 4 days in the jungle, easy work, Vishai said, trying to mask his nerves with forced confidence. Niran shot him a glance. It's never easy out here. Stay sharp. This isn't just about the terrain. You know the stories. The group fell silent. Everyone had heard the rumors, disappearing patrols, phantom lights dancing through the trees, and echoes of voices in the dead of night calling soldiers by name. Their journey took them along narrow trails, weaving between towering bamboo and ancient fig trees, the forest alive with the constant hum of cicadas. By sunset, they set up camp near a small, dried-up creek bed. As they ate their meager rations, the wind carried in unsettling sound whispers. "Did you hear that?" Somchai asked, his voice low. "Just the wind," Aru muttered, though his eyes told another story, but Niran knew better. The wind didn't carry voices unless something else was speaking through it. The fire crackled weakly, throwing long shadows across the men's faces as they settled in for the night. Niran took the first watch, scanning the jungle with his flashlight. Hours passed in uneasy silence until snap. A branch broke in the distance. Niran tensed, gripping his rifle. His eyes darted toward the sound's direction, but the thick undergrowth revealed nothing. Then, faintly, he heard it. Niran, his heart hammered in his chest. He turned, expecting to see one of his men, but they were all asleep by the fire. The voice came again, closer this time. Niran. He spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. Morning couldn't come soon enough. At dawn, the team prepared to move out. Niran kept his fear to himself but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The jungle around them felt heavier, as if it were closing in. "Let's stay sharp. There's something wrong with this place," he ordered. The trail ahead led them deeper into the jungle, toward an old abandoned outpost, a remnant from conflicts long past. The air grew colder as they approached, even though the midday sun was blazing overhead. Inside the crumbling structure, they found rusted equipment, faded photographs of soldiers long gone, and on one wall deep scratches that hadn't been worn down by time. "It's like something was trying to get out," Vishai whispered, tracing the marks with his fingers. Niran's gut twisted. Or trying to keep something in. What began as a standard patrol mission for Sergeant Niran and his team quickly turned unsettling. Strange whispers in the night, shadows lurking in the dense foliage, and signs of an unseen presence have already begun to chip away at their sense of safety. Now, as they push deeper into the jungle, the line between reality and nightmare begins to blur. The sun filtered weakly through the thick jungle canopy, casting fragmented rays on the worn-out faces of the team. No one had slept well, especially Niran, whose name had been called by something unseen the night before. "Did anyone else hear anything last night?" Niran asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Somchai and Aru exchanged uneasy glances, but it was Vishai who finally spoke up. "I thought I heard footsteps circling the camp. But when I looked, there was nothing." Niran nodded, suppressing his own fear. "Stay close, don't wander off the trail." By midday, the group approached a narrow ravine. The air grew thick, as if the jungle itself was pressing down on them. Their boots sank into soft, wet earth with every step, the silence only broken by the distant calls of unseen birds or something that sounded like birds. That's when Sobchai stopped. "Captain, look at this." On the side of the trail were fresh footprints, small, bare, and leading deeper into the forest. They were too small to belong to any of the men. "Children, out here?" Aru asked, doubt lacing his voice. "No, we're miles from any village," Niran replied, his eyes narrowing. "And why would children be barefoot out here?" A chill crept down their spines. Without another word, they pressed on, their movements slower now, every snapped twig making their nerves tighten. By late afternoon, the patrol stumbled upon something unexpected, a small, weathered shrine tucked beneath the roots of a massive tree. Incense sticks, long burned out, lay scattered around, and faded symbols were carved into the stone. "This isn't on any map," Dishai muttered. Niran studied the shrine carefully. It's old, maybe older than the border itself. As they turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, scattering dead leaves and whispering through the branches like distant voices. "Go back." The voice was faint, but clear enough to freeze them in place. "Did you hear that?" Sobchai asked, clutching his rifle tightly. "Yeah," Aru whispered. "We all did." That night, the men set up camp as far from the shrine as they could, though the feeling of being watched never left them. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across the dense jungle walls. Niran took the first watch again. Hours passed in silence until he saw something across the fire, a figure, just beyond the light's edge. A small child, standing barefoot, staring directly at him. "Niran," Sobchai's voice broke the silence. "Who are you talking to?" Niran blinked. The figure was gone. "I thought I saw something," he muttered, unsure if it was exhaustion or something far more sinister. But deep inside, he knew the jungle was not done with them yet. The third day on patrol began with a heavy mist rolling through the dense jungle. The sun's rays barely penetrated the thick canopy, and every step felt heavier than the last. Captain Anand led the team forward, trying to mask the growing unease that settled over everyone like the damp air around them. Private Somchai, usually the most talkative of the group, was silent. His eyes darted nervously through the undergrowth. "Did anyone hear that last night?" he finally asked, voice low. It sounded like whispering coming from the trees. Sergeant Wichai gave him a stern look. "The jungle plays tricks on you. Stay focused." But as the day wore on, the whispers returned, soft, unintelligible murmurs floating on the wind. At first, the soldiers dismissed them as natural sounds of the forest. But soon, the whispers became distinct, as if voices were calling their names from the shadows. That night, their campfire struggled against the suffocating darkness. As they tried to rest, Captain Anand heard it too, a soft voice, distant yet familiar, calling his name from beyond the tree line. "Anand." He bolted upright, gun in hand. No one was there. The jungle remained still. Suddenly, a scream tore through the silence. Private Somchai was missing. His sleeping bag lay empty, the ground disturbed by drag marks leading into the dense foliage. The team rushed into the trees with flashlights, following the trail until it abruptly stopped at a clearing with no footprints, no sign of struggle, only an eerie silence. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, chilling sound of laughter echoing through the trees. They weren't alone. The fourth day of the patrol began with an eerie silence. The usual sounds of insects and birds seemed to have vanished overnight, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. Sergeant Niran, exhausted but determined, led the small unit deeper into the jungle. The trees loomed tall and twisted, as if nature itself was watching. The thick fog clung to the ground, swallowing their footsteps. Every branch that cracked underfoot echoed louder than it should have, as if the forest were amplifying their fear. Private Somchai, the youngest in the group, finally spoke up. "Sergeant, have you heard the legend of the Whispering Shadows?" Niran shot him a tired look but didn't dismiss him. "They say spirits of the lost soldiers from the old conflict still wander this border. Anyone who hears their whispers never returns the same." Niran stayed silent. He had heard stories like this before, superstitions passed down from the older soldiers. But tonight, the forest made him wonder if there was more truth to the legend than he wanted to believe. As night fell, the unit set up camp in a small clearing. Just as they were settling in, Corporal Wanchai froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The others stopped moving. In the stillness of the night, a faint, breathy murmur echoed through the trees. It was a voice, low and indistinct, calling from the shadows beyond their campfire. "Who's there?" Niran called out, his voice steady but low. No reply, only the chilling return of silence. Suddenly, Somchai's eyes widened with fear. "Sergeant, it's saying my name." Everyone turned to him. The voice grew clearer now, almost playful. The wind seemed to carry the sound, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Without warning, Somchai staggered toward the edge of the camp, as if drawn by some invisible force. Niran lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "Snap out of it," he shouted. Somchai's eyes were glazed, his body cold to the touch. The whispers grew louder, circling the camp, calling for each of them in turn. And then complete silence. The fog lifted just enough for them to realize Somchai was gone. Niran and his team searched the entire area, but there was no trace of Somchai, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just the suffocating darkness of the jungle. As dawn approached, Niran found something half buried in the dirt near their camp. Somchai's dog tag, cold as ice. The remaining team members looked at each other with haunted eyes. They knew the truth deep down: some things in this forest were never meant to be found. The legend of the Whispering Shadows was no longer just a story. As dawn broke on their fourth day of patrol, Sergeant Niran, Private Somchai, and Corporal Anand found themselves deep within the thickest part of the jungle. The air was heavy with mist, and the thick canopy above swallowed the sun's light, leaving them in a perpetual gloom. "We should have reached the checkpoint by now," Somchai muttered, eyes darting nervously around the darkened trail. "The compass says we're on course," Anand replied, but his voice lacked confidence. Every tree seemed to lean closer, every shadow stretched unnaturally long. Suddenly, Niran froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. A faint rustling echoed through the trees, followed by soft, disjointed whispers. Not words, just sounds, as if the forest itself was murmuring. But there was something more disturbing. The whispers were slowly circling them, moving unseen through the dense foliage. They moved faster, hearts pounding, but the trail beneath their boots seemed unfamiliar, twisting in ways that didn't match the maps or memory. "We're going in circles," Somchai said, pointing to a broken branch they had marked hours ago. Panic flickered in his eyes. "No," Niran replied firmly, though fear was starting to gnaw at him too. "It's something playing tricks on us." As night fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds, branches snapping in the distance, low growls carried on the wind, and the occasional flash of movement in their peripheral vision. Suddenly, Somchai stumbled and fell, his hand landing on something cold and metallic. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat an old Thai military dog tag, half buried in the dirt. The name had been scratched off. "This can't be here," Somchai whispered, his voice trembling. "No one's patrolled this deep in years." Niran took a deep breath. "We need to set camp here and stay together. No wandering off. Whatever's out there, it's trying to separate us." As they gathered around their small fire, the jungle seemed to close in even tighter, and those disjointed whispers never stopped. The forest was alive and it was watching. Little did they know, by morning, one of them would be gone. The jungle was unnervingly quiet. The usual symphony of cicadas and rustling leaves had faded into a dead silence. Sergeant Niran, exhausted but determined, led the team forward, their faces hollowed by days of fear and restless nights. Each shadow seemed alive, each gust of wind a whisper from unseen eyes. Suddenly, they stumbled upon something none of them were prepared for: a makeshift shrine deep within the forest. Candles, long melted, formed eerie shapes, and small wooden effigies hung from the trees around them. The air was thick with the scent of decay and incense. Private Somchai froze. "Sir, I've heard stories about this. Some say these shrines mark places where spirits dwell, offerings to keep them calm." Sergeant Niran's voice was hoarse but steady. "We move around it, no touching, no speaking until we're clear." But as they skirted the shrine, a cold wind swept through the trees. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally. The sound of footsteps echoed not from the ground but from the trees above. They didn't dare look up. Midnight approached, and the group set up a final camp, their nerves frayed beyond reason. The fire flickered weakly, barely holding back the oppressive darkness. Then, without warning, the wind carried a low chant, voices whispering in a language none of them understood. Suddenly, Private Somchai screamed. His eyes were wide with terror as he pointed into the shadows. "They're here, they're watching." Sergeant Niran tried to calm him, But before he could react, Somchai collapsed, eyes rolled back, murmuring incoherently. The others circled around him, fear gripping their hearts. When the fire died on its own, plunging them into darkness. All around them, glowing eyes blinked into existence, hundreds of them, watching in silence. Desperation drove Niran to grab Somchai, dragging him up. We move, now. They didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke, the oppressive presence lifted. The jungle seemed normal again, birds sang, and the wind whispered through the trees like nothing had happened. The soldiers emerged from the jungle days later, hollow-eyed and broken. Somchai never spoke again. When Niran filed his report, he left out the details, no mention of shrines, glowing eyes, or whispers in the dark. Some stories, he knew, were better left untold. But deep in the borderlands, the jungle never forgets. The ghost who hired a movie at Enchanted Forest. It started with an unusual phone call. Somchai, a middle-aged traveling film projectionist, was sitting in his small shop in Udon Thani when his old Nokia phone rang. The voice on the other end was deep, slow, and slightly distorted. I would like to hire you for a film screening at Enchanted Forest. Somchai felt a chill run down his spine. Enchanted Forest was infamous, known for its eerie atmosphere and supernatural legends, particularly those tied to the Naga spirits. People rarely ventured deep into the forest at night. Are you sure? Somchai hesitated. That's a strange place to show a movie. The caller remained silent for a few seconds before responding. I will pay triple your usual fee. Just bring your equipment and arrive before sundown. Somchai glanced at his assistant, Wit, a young man in his 20s who had been helping him with film screenings for the past year. Wit raised an eyebrow, clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. Who's that? Wit asked. Somchai covered the receiver. Someone wants us to screen a movie in Enchanted Forest. Wit immediately looked uneasy. That place is cursed, Somchai. You know the stories. No one goes there at night. Somchai nodded but couldn't ignore the offer. Triple the usual fee was tempting. All right, Somchai said into the phone. We'll be there before sunset. The voice on the other end simply said, Good, before the line went dead. The journey to Enchanted. Later that afternoon, Somchai, Wit, and two other workers, Ek and Noi, loaded their truck with a 16mm film projector, reels, and a large screen. They set off towards Enchanted Forest as the sun began its descent. The ride was long and uneventful, but the closer they got, the more uneasy the group felt. The road leading to the forest was narrow and flanked by towering trees. There was a strange stillness in the air, no birds, no insects. As they approached the meeting point, Somchai scanned the surroundings. No sign of the person who had hired them. Where is our client? Ek muttered. Somchai took out his phone and dialed the number from earlier. No response. Maybe they'll come once we start setting up, Wit suggested, though his voice lacked confidence. Reluctantly, they unloaded the equipment and began assembling the screen in a clearing. The old trees around them cast long, unnatural shadows as dusk approached. That was when Somchai noticed something unsettling. There were no signs of human activity. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here before them. Something doesn't feel right, Noi whispered. Then, just as they finished setting up, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, bringing with it an eerie whispering sound. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly. And in that moment, Somchai realized one thing. They were completely alone, or at least they should have been. But as he turned to glance into the darkening forest, he could have sworn he saw silhouettes standing between the trees. The night had fallen. The only light in the clearing came from the dim glow of their truck's headlights and the flickering film projector, casting long, distorted shadows on the trees. The thick silence of Enchanted Forest felt suffocating. Somchai wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. All right, let's start, he muttered, signaling Wit to roll the film. The projector whirred to life, the old 16mm reel spinning, and soon, the first scene of an old Thai action film illuminated the large white screen. The silent crowd. As the film began, Somchai turned towards the forest's edge and froze. Silhouettes. Dozens of dark figures stood between the trees, motionless, watching the screen in absolute silence. Their outlines were faint, barely visible in the dim light. Look at that, Noi whispered, nudging Wit, his face pale. Wit's mouth hung open. Where did they come from? The oldest of the crew took a deep breath and tried to rationalize. Maybe the locals heard about the movie and came to watch. But why are they so quiet? Wit asked. And why does no one have a flashlight or a phone? Somchai swallowed hard. Something felt wrong. Usually, at outdoor screenings, the audience would chat, laugh, or react to the movie. But here? Not a single sound. Just silent figures standing still. Somchai forced himself to focus on the film. Maybe they were just shy. Maybe they were just watching respectfully. Then he noticed something even stranger. The movie played on, but the audience did not move. No shifting, no adjusting positions, no turning heads. They stood completely still as if frozen in time. Wit nudged Somchai. I don't like this. We should leave. We can't, Somchai whispered back. We took the money. We need to finish the job. But as soon as he said that, the projector flickered. The film glitched, showing distorted images for a brief second. And in that flickering moment, Somchai's heart stopped. Because for just a split second, the screen showed something that wasn't part of the movie. It showed a field of burning bodies. Somchai blinked in horror, but by the time the film stabilized, the normal movie continued as if nothing had happened. What the hell was that? Noi whispered, his hands shaking. I don't know, Somchai said, voice unsteady. Just keep playing it, maybe it was a film error. But deep down, he knew. Something unnatural was happening. And then the worst part came. As Somchai glanced back at the audience, his breath caught in his throat. The figures were disappearing. One by one, the silhouettes faded into nothingness as if melting into the darkness. Within seconds, the entire crowd was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. Somchai and his crew stood frozen, their blood running cold. And that was when Wit whispered the most terrifying thing of all. Somchai, look at the ground. Somchai looked down and saw no footprints. Whoever or whatever had been watching had never actually been there. The moment they realized there were no footprints, the air around them turned suffocating. Somchai's hands trembled as he turned off the projector. The whirring sound faded, and silence swallowed them. The vast emptiness of Camp Chanat Forest stretched before them, no sign of the audience that had been there just moments ago. This isn't right, Noi whispered. His voice was barely audible over the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Wit's breathing was shallow. What the hell just happened? No one had an answer. Ek, the oldest of the group, tried to keep his cool. We were probably just tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. No, Somchai said, shaking his head. We all saw them. We all saw them disappear. The forest seemed to close in around them. Every shadow felt alive. Every tree seemed to whisper secrets they couldn't understand. Then, crunch, a footstep, from the darkness behind the screen. The crew turned at the same time, eyes wide with fear. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. Eek's voice was tense. We pack up, now. They moved fast. Noi yanked the film reel from the projector. Wit folded the screen, his hands shaking. Somchai tried to keep calm, but his skin crawled with the undeniable feeling that they were being watched. And then, the whispering started. It began as a faint murmur, like a distant conversation. But there was no one else around. Then the whispers grew closer. Low voices, speaking words they couldn't understand, circling around them. Some of the whispers sounded like laughter, while others sounded like crying. Noi gasped, who's there? The whispering stopped. A deep silence followed. Then, a voice clearer than the rest, coming from directly behind them, whispered Somchai's name, Somchai. Somchai spun around, and there was no one there. His heart pounded, his mouth was dry. Did you hear that? He stammered. Noi and Wit nodded slowly. Their faces were pale. Ak muttered a prayer under his breath. We need to leave. They grabbed the last of their equipment and ran towards the truck. The whispers followed them, surrounding them from every direction, growing louder, more desperate, more angry. It felt like the forest itself was trying to keep them there. Finally, they reached the truck. Somchai fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking too much to fit them into the ignition. Come on, come on, come on. Noi screamed. The whispers stopped. Silence. Then, a loud bang on the side of the truck. Something had hit it, hard. Everyone screamed. Somchai turned the key and the engine roared to life. The headlights flashed onto the dirt road, illuminating the path ahead. And for just a split second, standing in the middle of the road, they saw a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes staring at them. Somchai hit the gas. The truck sped forward, barreling through the night, away from Camp Chanad Forest. But as they fled, the whispers did not stop. They followed them, riding the wind, whispering their names. And Somchai had the terrifying realization: this wasn't over. The truck raced down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Somchai gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Noi sat frozen in the passenger seat, heart pounding against his ribs. In the back, Ek and Wit clutched onto the equipment, their breaths uneven, eyes darting toward the shadowed trees lining the path. But even as they fled, the whispers followed. Low, distorted voices crawled into their ears, whispering their names in a language that made no sense. Some were giggling, others weeping. And then, something hit the roof of the truck. Thump! Somchai swerved. What the hell was that? Ek turned to look through the back window, and his face went pale. Oh my god. The others turned just in time to see something slide off the top of the truck and land on the road behind them. A shadowy figure, its limbs too long, its face blurred, but its eyes empty and hollow, staring directly at them. And then, it started running after them. Somchai pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck's tires kicked up dirt, speeding past trees that looked identical, as if they had been driving in circles. Wit checked his phone. No signal. The GPS was frozen. We should have hit the main road by now, Noi stammered, voice shaking. We're trapped, Ek whispered. The forest outside seemed to warp, twisting in unnatural ways. Trees shifted, their branches stretching toward the truck. Shadows flickered between them, darting closer and closer. And then, out of nowhere, a giant movie screen stood in the middle of the road. The same one they had just packed up. The film was still rolling. The projector, which should have been in the back of their truck, was there, playing a movie they had never seen before. On the screen, a recording of them played. Not from earlier that night, it was showing them right now. Them inside the truck, the exact moment they were in. Somchai slammed the brakes. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them from every direction. And then, the screen flickered. The image changed. It now showed the audience. The same people they had seen earlier, motionless, staring at the screen, faces blank, eyes lifeless. And slowly, each head turned toward the camera. Toward them, one by one, they smiled. A voice, deeper than anything human, echoed through the trees. Finish the show. Somchai's hand shook. His breath was ragged. No, this isn't real. The audience on the screen started to stand up. The figures in the forest started moving toward the truck. The whispers turned into screams. Noi clutched his head, his body trembling. Wit was praying under his breath. Eek's eyes were filled with horror. We should have never come here. Somchai tried to start the truck. The engine stalled. The figures drew closer. On the screen, the camera zoomed in on them, trapping them inside the movie. And then, the screen shut off. Everything went black. The show must go on. The next morning, locals passing by found their truck abandoned on the road leading out of Camp Chanad Forest. Inside, the film reels sat neatly stacked, the projector resting beside them. But Somchai, Noi, Ek, and Wit were nowhere to be found. The only thing left behind was the final frame from the movie. A grainy, distorted image of four men, standing in the middle of a vast, empty audience, staring directly at the camera. Their faces blurred, their eyes hollow. And in the corner of the film strip, a title was burned into the celluloid. The show never ends. A grainy, distorted image of four men, standing in the middle of a vast, empty audience, staring directly at the camera. Their faces blurred, their eyes hollow. And in the corner of the film strip, a title was burned into the celluloid. The show never ends. The next morning, the villagers gathered at the entrance of Camp Chanad Forest. A rumor had spread Somchai and his team never returned home. Their families, desperate for answers, pleaded with the locals to search for them. A small search party was formed, led by an elderly man named Uncle Thong, who had lived near Camp Chanad his entire life. With weathered hands and knowing eyes, he held his wooden walking stick tightly, his face dark with concern. "This isn't the first time," he muttered. "What do you mean?" asked one of the villagers. Uncle Thong sighed. People disappear here, some are found, but they never return the same. The group exchanged uneasy glances before heading into the woods, the abandoned truck. It didn't take long for them to find Somchai's truck, parked awkwardly by the dirt path. The keys were still in the ignition, the doors left slightly open. Inside, everything was untouched. The film reels, the projector, even the catch from the mysterious client was still there. But the men Somchai, Noi, Ek, and Wit were gone. No tracks led away from the vehicle, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. One of the younger men in the search party, Lek, turned to Uncle Thong. What do you think happened? The old man's grip on his stick tightened. They were taken. Lek frowned. Taken by who? Uncle Thong exhaled slowly. Long ago, before this forest was called Kamchanad, the land belonged to the serpent spirits. It is said that the Naga ruled these parts and did not tolerate those who disturbed their home. The villagers listened in silence. There is an old belief that spirits still roam these trees, watching, waiting. They can trick your eyes, steal your voice, and if they take a liking to you, he tapped his walking stick on the ground. They keep you. The group shuddered. Lex swallowed hard. So what do we do now? Uncle Thon looked at the forest, his expression grim. We pray they come back. A whisper in the wind. As the sun began to set, the search party split into smaller groups. They called out Somchai's name. They walked through the thick undergrowth, looking for any sign, any clue. But the deeper they went, the quieter it became. No insects, no birds, just silence. Then, Lek heard something. A whisper, his name. Spoken in Somchai's exact voice. Lek, come here. His blood turned cold. Lek turned around and froze. Standing between the trees was Somchai. Or at least something that looked like him. But there was something wrong. Somchai's face was blurred, shifting like a bad TV signal. His body twitched unnaturally, like a puppet, on invisible strings, and then he smiled. Too wide, too unnatural. Lek tried to scream, but his throat locked up. And in that moment, he knew. Somchai was no longer Somchai. Lek stood frozen. His breath hitched in his throat as the distorted figure of Somchai tilted its head, as if studying him. The whispering voice continued, calling his name in a tone that was almost amused. Lek, don't be afraid, come closer. No. Everything inside him screamed nitrogen monoxide. But his legs wouldn't move. The trees around him blurred, twisting into shadows that seemed to reach out. The air became heavy, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then the thing that looked like Somchai took a step forward. Its feet didn't touch the ground. Lek's heart pounded. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But all he could do was watch in horror as the figure's mouth stretched wider than any human should be able to. And from that darkness, more voices joined in. The return. A sudden chanting broke through the night. Uncle Thong's voice rang loud and clear, his prayers echoing through the forest. The moment the words left his lips, the figure of Somchai flickered like a dying flame. Its grin vanished. A gust of wind tore through the trees, sending chilled air rushing over Lek's skin. And in that instant, the figure disappeared. Lek gasped, stumbling backward. He was alone again. The whispers were gone. The presence had vanished. And then, from the darkness, a voice. Help us. Lek turned sharply. Somchai, Noi, Ek, and Wit stood there. Their clothes were torn. Their faces pale and hollow, eyes dark as if they had seen something no human should. They looked lost, confused, but they were alive, or at least they seemed to be. The search party rushed them back to the village. Their families cried with relief, but something was off. Somchai and his team couldn't explain what happened. They only remembered the movie starting, then darkness. Nothing else, and there was one more thing. They never blinked. Days passed, and though they returned to their normal routines, the villagers whispered behind their backs. They weren't the same. Somchai didn't laugh the same way. Noi's smile never quite reached his eyes. And one night, a villager passing by Somchai's house swore they saw him standing in the dark, unmoving, staring at nothing for hours. Weeks later, Somchai's mother found something hidden under his bed. It was a roll of film, the same one from that night. Curious, she held it up to the light, and then she dropped it, screaming. Because in every frame of the film, the entire audience was there. Hundreds of shadowy figures sitting silently, watching, waiting. And in the last frame, they were all smiling. The long-awaited holiday had finally arrived for Mike and Jay, two lifelong friends from Bangkok. Both had been stuck in the endless cycle of work, deadlines, and city chaos. This break was their chance to escape the noise and reconnect with nature. Their destination? Hinerik Waterfall, nestled deep inside Khao Yai, a national park, a place known for its breathtaking beauty and chilling legends. Mike, the more adventurous of the two, couldn't hide his excitement as he loaded their bags into his old SUV. Dude, I've been dreaming about this trip for months. Just us, nature, and no emails. Jay, more cautious and superstitious by nature, gave a hesitant smile. Yeah. Just don't forget the stories about Hinerik. People say weird stuff happens there. Mike rolled his eyes. Come on, those are just ghost stories to scare tourists. We'll be fine, but deep down, even Mike couldn't shake the slight unease growing in his chest. The sun was just beginning to rise as they left the city behind, driving along Highway 1 toward Nakhon Nayok. The smooth road curved gently through small villages, endless green fields, and dense forests that whispered secrets from centuries past. The mood in the car was light at first, music blasting, snacks being devoured, and the occasional terrible joke from Mike. But as the road narrowed and twisted deeper into the heart of the park, the air grew heavier, and silence began to creep in. The vibrant greens of the jungle seemed darker here, the shadows between trees growing unnervingly deep. Jay couldn't help but glance nervously out the window. Have you noticed how quiet it's gotten? Mike shrugged, but the tension was starting to get to him, too. We're just in the middle of the forest. Nature's peaceful out here. A beat of silence passed. Then, out of nowhere, a soft giggle echoed faintly from the trees. Both men froze. Did you hear that? Jay's voice was low, tight with fear. Mike swallowed hard. It's probably just an animal, maybe a monkey. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. By late afternoon, they finally arrived at the designated camping area near Hinerik Waterfall. The sound of rushing water in the distance should have been comforting, but instead, it only added to the oppressive feeling that had been building since they entered the forest. They set up their tent quickly, trying to shake off the unease. That night, as they sat around a small campfire, Jay broke the silence. You remember the story, right, about the kid who fell into the waterfall? Mike sighed. Yeah, tragic accident, right? Jay's eyes didn't leave the fire. Some say his spirit never left. People have reported hearing laughter near the falls. Like a child still playing. The air grew colder. The fire's crackle seemed louder now. Mike forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Ghost stories, man, just stories. But deep inside, both of them knew that some stories had roots in truth. Little did they realize, the real horror was only beginning, and soon, they'd learned that some laughter doesn't come from joy but from something far more sinister. Mike and Jay, two friends on a long-awaited vacation, have arrived at Hinerik Waterfall. Despite their excitement, a strange unease has followed them since their journey began, especially after hearing an unexplained giggle from the dense jungle. The jungle transformed as night fell. The lively chirping of birds faded into an unsettling silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen force. Their campfire cast long, dancing shadows on the trees, creating figures that seemed to twist and move when they weren't looking directly at them. Mike threw another log onto the fire, the flames flaring up briefly. We'll be fine, he said, more to himself than to Jay. We just need some sleep. Jay wasn't so sure. Every gust of wind carried a strange heaviness with it, a sense that something unseen was watching them from the darkness just beyond the fire's reach. Sometime past midnight, Jay stirred awake to the feeling of being watched. The forest outside was unnervingly still. He listened closely until he heard it again. A faint, playful giggle. This time, it was clearer, closer. Jay sat up and shook Mike awake. Dude, wake up, it's back. The laugh. Mike gradually rubbed his eyes. You're hearing things, man. Just go back to giggle. This time, Mike heard it too. His eyes snapped open, fully alert. Okay, that's not funny anymore. Without thinking, Mike grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside the tent, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just darkness and silence. Until the beam landed on something unusual. Small footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, tiny, barefoot impressions in the damp soil, leading toward the edge of the clearing. "Jay, come here. You need to see this." Against their better judgment, curiosity dragged them both toward the footprints. Each step deeper into the forest felt heavier, as if the air itself was thickening around them. Suddenly, the footprints just stopped. Right in the middle of the path, no signs of turning around. No disturbance in the undergrowth. It was as if the child had simply vanished into thin air. Jay's breath hitched. This doesn't make sense. Where could they have gone? Mike scanned the treetops. Maybe. Splash! Both of them froze as the sound echoed through the silence. The unmistakable noise of water coming from the direction of the waterfall. The rushing sound of Hineric waterfall grew louder as they approached. Moonlight reflected off the cascading water, creating ghostly patterns that danced across the rocks. And then they saw it. A small figure, standing on the very edge of the cliff, just before the waterfall plunged into the abyss below. A child, barely visible in the mist, her long black hair covering her face. She didn't move. Jay whispered, "Mike, do you see that?" Mike nodded slowly, his mouth dry. "Yeah, we should go back." But before they could turn around, the figure tilted its head unnaturally slow and laughed. The same chilling giggle that had haunted them since they arrived. Mike and Jay had just arrived at Hineric Waterfall after a long, winding journey through the dense jungle. The excitement of their vacation quickly turned into unease after hearing what sounded like a child's laughter echoing through the trees despite being completely alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the once vibrant jungle became cloaked in deep shadows. The only sounds were the rush of water crashing down the falls and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jay, clutching a flashlight, glanced nervously at Mike. "Did you hear that again?" Jay whispered, his voice almost swallowed by the roar of the waterfall. Mike nodded slowly. "Yes, like a giggle. But there's no way a kid would be out here this late." They set up camp a few hundred meters from the waterfall. The uneasy silence between them was thick with tension. The earlier excitement of their adventure had faded, replaced by a creeping dread neither could explain. Later that night, as they sat around their small campfire, the laughter returned closer this time. It was faint but unmistakable, a child's high-pitched giggle that seemed to circle around them. Jay's hand trembled slightly as he pointed his flashlight toward the trees. "Mike, what if this is one of those stories? You know, the ghost legends about Hineric." Mike tried to brush it off. "Ghost stories are just..." Before he could finish, something moved just beyond the edge of the light. A shadow, small. Quick! The laughter stopped abruptly. They froze. The air around them grew heavier, as if something unseen was watching. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and in that brief second of darkness, Mike saw it, a small silhouette standing by the trees, head slightly tilted, watching them. When the light returned, the figure was gone. Jay's voice cracked. "Did you see that?" Mike's jaw tightened. "Yeah. And I think we need to leave, now." But as they packed up in a rush, the sound returned again, closer than ever. Only this time, it wasn't laughter. It was a whisper. "Play with me." The whisper lingered in the air, wrapping around them like the thick jungle mist. Mike's pulse pounded in his ears as he zipped up his backpack with trembling hands. "Jay, we need to get out of here now," Mike hissed, his voice low but urgent. Jay, pale and wide-eyed, nodded silently. They grabbed their flashlights and started toward the narrow trail leading back to the park entrance. Every snap of a twig or brush of leaves against their shoulders felt like fingers reaching out from the dark. But as they hurried along the path, the laughter returned. It wasn't coming from behind them anymore, it was ahead. Giggle, giggle. Jay stopped suddenly, clutching Mike's arm. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Mike followed his friend's trembling gaze. There, just a few meters ahead, a small figure stood blocking the path, motionless, its features hidden by the shadows. The faint outline of long, tangled hair was just visible in the moonlight. "That can't be real," Jay muttered. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The oppressive silence around them was enough to tighten the grip of fear on their hearts. Then, without warning, the figure slowly tilted its head to the side just as Mike had seen by the camp earlier. The same eerie motion. "Mike, I think we're trapped," Jay said, his voice barely a whisper. Mike scanned the jungle around them. "We'll cut through the trees." "We're not staying on this path." As they turned off the trail and pushed through the thick foliage, the air grew colder. The jungle seemed to close in tighter, every branch clawing at their clothes. But no matter how far they moved, the laughter never faded. It followed them, circling like a predator. Suddenly, Jay's flashlight flickered and died. "Mike!" Jay's voice was filled with panic. Mike grabbed Jay's hand, pulling him forward. "Don't stop. Just keep moving." But the laughter was louder now, impossibly close. The trees seemed to whisper in voices that didn't belong to the wind. And then, a sharp, cold breath on the back of Mike's neck. "Play with me forever." Mike spun around, shining his flashlight wildly through the thick trees, but there was nothing, no figure, no child, just darkness swallowing the beam. "Did you feel that?" Mike's voice was shaky. Jay, panting and gripping Mike's arm tightly, nodded. "It was right behind us." The jungle seemed alive now. Branches creaked even though there was no wind, and every leaf rustled as if something unseen was slithering just out of sight. "Okay, listen," Mike whispered, trying to steady his breathing. "We need to head uphill. If we can find higher ground, maybe we'll get cell service or spot the trail again." They moved carefully now, every step slow and deliberate. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was too complete, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Jay froze. "Mike, look." In front of them, half buried in the dirt and leaves, lay a small, red shoe. Mike's stomach dropped. It looked brand new, too clean for something that should have been lost in the forest for long. The realization hit them both at once. "This can't be here," Jay whispered. "This isn't possible." The air grew icy, their breath forming small clouds in the beam of Mike's flashlight. And then they heard it again. A soft, breathy giggle. This time, it was right next to Jay's ear. Jay screamed and stumbled backward, dropping his dead flashlight. Mike grabbed him before he could fall. "Run." They sprinted through the jungle, branches slicing across their arms and faces. But no matter how fast they ran, the giggles followed, echoing from every direction. Faster, faster. Suddenly, the ground beneath them vanished. They tumbled down a steep slope, crashing through bushes and rocks until they hit the cold, hard ground below. Mike groaned, pushing himself up. "Jay, are you okay?" Jay stirred, clutching his ankle. "I think I twisted it." Mike looked around, shining his light up the slope. It was too steep to climb, and worse, there was no laughter anymore. No sound at all. Then Mike noticed something carved into a tree nearby, small handprints smeared in dark red. His stomach twisted. "We're not alone down here." Suddenly, Jay's phone buzzed. A message appeared on the cracked screen, though there was no signal. "You shouldn't have followed me." The jungle's silence shattered with a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream. The cold silence pressed against them like a physical weight. Jay clutched his injured ankle while Mike scanned the darkness, his flashlight now flickering weakly. "Mike," Jay whispered, voice tight with fear. "What if we never get out?" Mike forced a calm tone. "We will. We just need to keep moving. Someone will find us." But even as he said it, the feeling of dread only deepened. Suddenly, a faint light appeared ahead, an unnatural, bluish glow seeping through the trees. "Do you see that?" Jay asked, his voice barely audible. Mike nodded. "Stay close." They limped toward the glow, but as they drew nearer, the air grew icy, and the oppressive silence returned. The light revealed itself a small clearing with a weathered stone shrine in the center, covered in moss and offerings long decayed. On the shrine's surface, a photograph sat under cracked glass, an image of a young girl with dark eyes, wearing the same red shoes they'd found earlier. Jay's voice trembled. "It's her." Suddenly, the air thickened with a whisper. "You heard me." The laughter returned, but this time, it wasn't playful. It was full of sorrow and pain, echoing from everywhere at once. Shadows circled them, and the temperature dropped sharply. Mike gritted his teeth. "We need to finish this." He reached into his backpack, pulling out a small charm his grandmother had given him before the trip, a protective talisman. "Place it on the shrine," Jay urged. Mike carefully laid the charm on the stone, whispering a silent apology to whatever spirit haunted this place. The laughter twisted into a high-pitched wail, shaking the trees around them. Then silence. The cold lifted. The air felt lighter. The oppressive darkness began to recede. Jay's phone suddenly buzzed. The message on the screen read, "Thank you." The shadow of the woman at Srinath National Park. The road stretched before them, winding through the misty mountains like a serpent. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine trees. Dan tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the car climbed higher into the wilderness. This is going to be amazing. Khan grinned from the passenger seat, adjusting his sunglasses. A whole week of nothing but nature, fresh air, and a break from reality. Dan chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. Yeah, man, we deserve this. No work, no stress, just us and the great outdoors. Their plan was simple: drive up to Srinath National Park, set up camp near the famous cliffs, and spend the week hiking, stargazing, and soaking in the beauty of northern Thailand. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, an uneasy feeling crept into Don's chest. The road had become narrower, and the trees pressed in from both sides like silent watchers. The occasional road sign was rusted, barely readable. The farther they went, the fewer cars they saw. This road feels different, Dan muttered. Kong waved him off. Dude, it's just because we're out in the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no buildings, pure nature. Dan nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. As they rounded a sharp curve, a figure appeared ahead, standing on the side of the road. A woman. She was dressed in a white blouse and a long, flowing skirt, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. She stood unnaturally still, her face hidden in the shadow of the trees. Don's heart skipped a beat. What the hell, he whispered. Khan leaned forward. Is she hitchhiking? The woman did not move. As they got closer, Dan instinctively slowed the car. Something about her felt wrong. Then, just as their headlights illuminated her fully, she vanished. Dan slammed on the brakes. Shit. Kong yelled as the tires skidded slightly before coming to a stop. Don's hands trembled on the wheel. Did you see that? Shishi was just there. Kong exhaled shakily. Yeah. But she's gone. Maybe it was a trick of the light, fog, maybe? Don's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew what he saw. They were still miles away from the national park. The road ahead was empty. But a chill had settled in the car, a silent, invisible presence that neither of them could shake. Without another word, Dan pressed the gas. They drove on, and the trees seemed closer than before. Dan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The air inside the car was thick with tension, the memory of the vanishing woman still fresh in their minds. Maybe we should turn back, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Khan, usually the fearless one, let out a shaky laugh. Dude, we're just freaked out. We're almost there, let's not let our minds play tricks on us. Dan sighed, nodding reluctantly. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but something deep in his gut told him that this trip was not going to be normal. The arrival. After another hour of driving through the lonely mountain roads, they finally reached the entrance to Srinath National Park. The sign, barely illuminated by their headlights, looked old and weathered. The wooden post was cracked, and the words were slightly faded, as if time itself had tried to erase them. Khan hopped out of the car, stretching. Damn, that was a long drive, but look at this place, man. Totally worth it. Dan stepped out cautiously, taking in the surroundings. The air was strangely still. No sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves. Just silence. He shivered. Khan clapped him on the shoulder. Let's find a camping spot before it gets too dark. They grabbed their gear and headed into the park. A place to camp. After walking for about 15 minutes, they found a perfect spot, a clearing with a view of the famous cliffs of Srinath. Below them, a thick layer of fog rolled through the valley like an ocean of mist. Khan whistled. Man, this view is insane. Dan forced a smile. Yeah, it is. They quickly set up their tent, built a small fire, and sat down to eat. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the trees. Dan tried to shake off his unease, focusing instead on the stars above. For a while, things felt normal. Then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, a soft murmur carried by the wind. Dan looked up from his food. Did you hear that? Kong frowned. Hear what? Dan held his breath, listening. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying something else with it, a voice. A woman's voice. It was distant but getting closer. Help me. Don's stomach twisted. Kong froze. This time, he heard it too. Help me. The voice was barely audible, like someone whispering from deep within the trees. Don's skin crawled. What the hell is that? Kong swallowed hard, glancing around. Probably just the wind. Yeah, wind does weird shit in the mountains. Dan wasn't convinced. But before he could say anything else, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness. They both turned toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness. But then Dan saw it. A shadow standing at the edge of the trees. Tall, still. Watching them, Don's breath caught in his throat. Kong, he whispered, barely able to speak. But when he blinked, the shadow was gone. The fire crackled, the wind howled. Dan and Kong sat there, frozen. Somewhere in the trees, something was waiting. The fire flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the ground. Don's heart pounded in his chest. He was sure of what he had seen: a shadow, standing just beyond the trees, watching them. But now, there was nothing. Kong let out a shaky laugh, though it sounded forced. Dude, you're scaring yourself. Don's mouth was dry. I swear I saw something. Kong tossed another log into the fire, the embers crackling. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. You've been on edge since that thing on the road. Dan wanted to believe him. Maybe it really was just the wind, the dark, the exhaustion messing with his head. And yet, deep in his gut, he knew something was wrong. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The earlier whispering sound was gone, but a strange, unsettling stillness had settled around them. Dan yawned and rubbed his arms. We should get some sleep. Big hike tomorrow. Kong nodded, finishing his last sip of water before crawling into the tent. Dan followed, zipping the entrance shut behind him. But as he lay down, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, his mind kept replaying the shadow. The way it stood so still, the way it seemed to watch them. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and then something woke him up. Don's eyes flew open, his breath hitched. Crunch, a footstep, right outside their tent. His body went rigid. His mind raced. Maybe it was Kong. Slowly, Dan turned his head, peeking toward Kong's sleeping bag. Kong was still there. Fast asleep. Crunch. Another step. Closer. Dan squeezed his eyes shut. His hands clenched the sleeping bag. His heart slammed against his ribs. Then a shadow passed over the tent. It was faint, just a flicker against the fabric. But Dan saw it. Someone or something was outside. Dan held his breath, hoping it would go away. But then, from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent, a whisper, soft, deliberate, "Come here." Don's blood ran cold. "Come closer." The voice was unmistakably female. His body refused to move, every muscle frozen in sheer terror. Then the tent zipper moved. It started to open. Dan finally reacted. "Kong, wake up," he shouted, shaking his friend violently. Kong jolted awake, confused. What's going on?" Dan scrambled for his flashlight and shined it at the tent entrance. Nothing. The zipper was partially open, but there was no one there. Kong sat up, rubbing his face. "Jesus, man, what the hell?" Don's breath was shaky. There was something outside. "I swear, I saw a shadow." And the zipper, it started moving on its own. Kong grabbed his own flashlight and turned it toward the trees. Nothing but endless darkness. "Dan, look, you're freaking yourself out," Kong said, though there was an uneasiness in his voice. "No one's here." Dan wasn't convinced, but what could he say? That a whisper had called to him. That something had tried to open their tent in the middle of the night. He took a deep breath. Maybe he was just sleep-deprived. Kong sighed. "Let's go back to sleep. All right, we have a long hike tomorrow." Dan nodded numbly, lying back down, though he knew he wouldn't be sleeping again tonight. And outside, just beyond their campsite, a shadow stood at the edge of the cliff, watching, waiting. The night stretched on in eerie silence. Dan lay awake in his sleeping bag, heart still racing from what had just happened. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves sent shivers through his body. He could still hear the voice in his head, soft, whispering, calling to him. "Come here, come closer." Dan didn't dare close his eyes again. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, Dan felt like he had barely rested. Kong stirred beside him, stretching and yawning. "You look like hell," Kong said, rubbing his eyes. Dan sat up slowly. "Didn't sleep," Kong sighed. "Man, you really let last night get to you, huh?" "Look, it was probably the wind or some animal messing with the tent." Dan didn't argue, but deep inside, he knew what he had experienced. They packed up their camp and prepared for the long trek ahead. The trail they were taking would lead them to the famous Pha Chu Cliff, one of the most breathtaking viewpoints in the entire park. As they walked, Dan couldn't shake the unease clinging to him. The deeper they went into the forest, the heavier the air felt, like something unseen was watching. 2 hours into the hike, they reached a clearing where the land sloped downward into mist-covered hills. The scenery was stunning, but Don's eyes were drawn to something far more disturbing. A figure stood at the edge of the cliff, a woman. She was facing away from them, wearing a flowing white dress, her long black hair cascading down her back. Dan froze. Something about her felt off. "Kong, do you see that?" Kong followed Don's gaze. The moment his eyes landed on the woman, his face went pale. "No way," Kong whispered. She wasn't there a second ago." Don's breath hitched. "Should we go check?" Kong hesitated. "Hell no, dude. Something's not right." But even as Kong said it, the woman started to turn. Her movements were slow and unnatural, like a glitch in a video. And then her face was visible. Don's stomach dropped. She had no eyes. The plunge. Dan and Kong stumbled backward. The woman's hollow sockets were nothing but darkness. Her lips curved into a twisted smile. Then, she stepped forward. And she fell, right off the cliff. Dan gasped and ran toward the edge, his mind screaming at him to stop, but his body moving on instinct. He looked down. Nothing. No body. No sign of impact. Just endless mist swirling at the bottom of the cliff. Kong grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Dan nodded, barely able to breathe. As they turned to leave, a whisper drifted from the edge. "Come here." Don's blood froze, and just before they ran, he saw something in the corner of his eye. The woman was standing in the trees behind them, watching, waiting, and smiling. The forest was no longer just trees and shadows, it was alive. Every branch seemed to reach out. Every gust of wind whispered secrets that Dan and Kong didn't want to hear. The memory of the eyeless woman standing in the trees behind them clawed at their minds as they ran down the narrow path. The air grew thick, like invisible hands were trying to slow them down. "Dan, faster!" Kong shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Don's legs burned with exhaustion, but the fear propelling him forward was stronger than any physical pain. He could still hear the whispering behind them. "Come back. You can't leave." After what felt like hours, they finally stopped to catch their breath. Sweat dripped from their foreheads, and the air was unnaturally cold. Kong pulled out his phone. "We should be close to the trailhead by now." He opened the GPS and froze. "What's wrong?" Dan asked, panting. Kong showed him the screen. No signal, and worse, the map showed nothing but endless forest. "This can't be right," Kong muttered, scrolling frantically. "We were supposed to be out of here by now." Dan looked around. The trail they had been following was gone, vanished. There was no sign of a path, only dense trees pressing in on all sides. "We're lost," Dan whispered. Kong's hands trembled as he put his phone away. "We have to keep moving. Maybe we can find a landmark, or..." A sharp, high-pitched scream cut through the forest. Both men froze. It was coming from behind them. They started running again, pushing through thick undergrowth. Branches scratched their faces and arms, leaving angry red marks. Every time Dan dared to glance back, he saw shadows moving between the trees too fast to be human. Suddenly, the forest opened up to a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling spirit house, covered in moss and surrounded by wilting offerings, faded flowers, melted candles, and broken figurines. "Why would there be a spirit house all the way out here?" Dan asked, voice shaking. Kong didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something lying next to the small shrine. A shoe. Don's stomach twisted. It was a hiking boot, the same brand Kong was wearing. "It's mine," Kong whispered. "But how?" The air grew colder. Behind them, the whisper returned. "You're already mine." Dan turned slowly, dread pooling in his chest. She was there again. The eyeless woman. Her white dress floated unnaturally in the air, and touched by the wind. This time, she was close enough that Dan could see the tears of blood streaking down her pale cheeks. "Don't look at her," Kong screamed, yanking Dan away. They sprinted toward the other side of the clearing, diving into the trees. But no matter how fast they ran, the forest didn't end. The trees blurred together, the sky darkened, time twisted. Dan glanced behind them one last time and she was there. closer, reaching out, and then everything went black. Dan awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and an eerie silence that wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. His head throbbed, and every muscle in his body ached. The air was colder now, thick with dampness, and the faint smell of earth and decay filled his nostrils. Kong, his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. No answer. Dan slowly sat up, the memory of the eyeless woman flashing like a knife in his mind. The clearing, the spirit house, the chilling touch of her unseen hand, it all felt like a nightmare, except for the dull ache in his chest. He was alone. The forest around him was deathly still. No wind, no birds, no insects, only silence. Dan forced himself to stand and looked around, but the trees seemed endless in every direction. There was no sign of the spirit house, no sign of Kong. His heart pounded. This can't be happening. I just need to find the trail. Kong has to be nearby. Then, just as he took his first shaky step forward, a soft whisper floated through the air. Dan. The voice was familiar. It was Kong's voice, his breath caught in his throat. Kong, is that you? The voice came again, clearer now. Help me. Without thinking, Dan ran toward the sound, his shoes slipping on wet leaves. The whisper led him deeper into the forest, weaving between the gnarled trees like a ghost. Every time he thought he was close, the voice would move, pulling him farther in. Suddenly, he stumbled into another clearing, but this one was different. In the middle of the clearing stood a second spirit house identical to the one from before, but this time the offerings were fresh. Candles burned with steady flames, untouched by wind. A soft chanting filled the air, though no one was there. Don's stomach turned when he noticed something lying at the base of the shrine. Kong's jacket. His voice cracked as he whispered, "No, no, no, no." The air behind him shifted. He turned slowly and she was there. The eyeless woman stood just a few feet away, her head tilted slightly as if listening to his fear. Her mouth moved, but no words came out, only that same cold whisper filling Don's head. "Stay with me." Dan stumbled back, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body felt like it was sinking into the ground. The forest closed in around him, the trees tightening like a noose. Then a voice broke through the fog. Kong. It was faint, but it was real. Desperation fueled his final burst of energy. Dan turned and ran blindly through the trees, the whispers growing louder behind him, pulling at his sanity. He didn't stop until he saw light, real sunlight breaking through the trees. He crashed into an open path, collapsing onto the dirt trail. His vision blurred, and before everything went black, he heard a familiar voice. Dan, hey, stay with me, Kong. Dan woke up in a hospital bed days later. Kong sat beside him, pale but alive. They found us near the edge of the park, Kong explained. We were missing for 2 days. Don's voice was weak. The woman, did you see her? Kong nodded slowly. I saw her, and I think she let us go. But that night, as Dan tried to sleep, a soft whisper echoed in his ears. Stay with me. The shadow of the woman from Sri Lanka had followed him home. The sun hung low, painting the sky a dull orange, as Sergeant Chai led his squad into the dense jungle along the Thai-Myanmar border. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. 5 men trudged through the undergrowth. Chai, the grizzled leader with 15 years on the border. Lieutenant Crit, his stern deputy, Private Somchai, the jittery rookie. Corporal Lek, the squad's loudmouth, and Private Boone, the silent radio operator. Their mission was routine for days: to patrol a 20-kilometer stretch, check for smugglers or crossings, and report back. Simple, but the jungle had other plans. The first day unfolded quietly. Boots sank into mud, machetes hacked through vines, and the canopy above blocked out the sun. The soldiers bantered to ease the monotony, Lek cracking jokes about ghosts, Somchai asking nervous questions about the local legends. Chai ignored it. He'd heard the tales. Pachathep, the spirit forest, where the dead lingered. Superstition, he thought. Still, the jungle felt alive, its sounds to deliberate rustling leaves, distant bird calls, a faint hum beneath it all. By noon, they stopped at a stream to rest. Somchai knelt to fill his canteen, then froze. Sarge, you hear that? Chai listened. At first, just the jungle's chorus. Then, a murmur, low, overlapping voices, too faint to decipher. Wind, Chai said, though doubt gnawed at him. Boone clutched the radio tighter, saying nothing. Lek smirked. Why don't whisper, Sarge? Crit shot him a glare. Move out. The murmurs followed them, weaving through the trees as the trail narrowed. By dusk, they set up camp in a small clearing. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced too eagerly. Chai saw at first a silhouette, humanoid but twisted, standing just beyond the light. He blinked, and it vanished. Anyone see that? He asked. See what? Lek replied, his grin faltering. No one spoke. The jungle fell silent, an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears. Chai gripped his rifle and told himself it was fatigue. But sleep came hard that night, the whispers lingering in his dreams. Dawn broke heavy with mist. The squad packed up, their movements sluggish, eyes darting to the trees. The murmurs were gone, replaced by an eerie quiet. Chai led them deeper, the jungle growing denser, vines like ropes, roots clawing at their boots. Around midday, they stumbled on an abandoned outpost, its wooden walls rotting, overrun with creepers. Old border post, Crit said, stepping inside. Haven't used these in years. Inside, the air was stale. A rusted table, a broken chair and scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, forming symbols none of them recognized. Somchai traced one with his finger, then yanked his hand back. Feels wrong, he muttered. Probably smugglers, Chai said, unconvinced. As they left, Lek tripped over something half-buried, a cracked helmet. Thai military issue, stained with something dark. Blood, he asked, half joking. Old, Boone whispered, his first words all day. Too old. That afternoon, the whispers returned, louder, calling their names. Chai Lek Somchai, the voices drifted from all directions, soft but insistent. The squad froze, rifles raised. Who's out there? Crit shouted. No answer, just the echoes fading into the trees. Stay sharp, Chai ordered, his voice steady despite the chill down his spine. By nightfall, they camped near a banyan tree, its gnarled roots sprawling like fingers. The fire barely pierced the darkness. Then Somchai screamed, pointing at the trees. Faces pale, eyelids peered from the shadows, vanishing when Chai swung his flashlight. Tricks of the light. Crit barked, but his hands shook. Bloom sat apart, muttering prayers under his breath. The whispers grew into a chant, rhythmic and alien, until the fire flared green and died. They relit it, hearts pounding, and took turns on watch. No one slept. The third day dawned gray, the sky swallowed by the canopy. The squad moved like ghosts, exhaustion etching their faces. The jungle shifted around them, paths they'd marked disappeared. Trees seemed closer than before. The whispers were constant now, a drone that burrowed into their skulls. Mid-morning, Boone vanished. One moment he was behind them, the next gone. They searched, shouting his name, but the jungle swallowed their voices. An hour later, he stumbled back, pale and trembling. It took me, he rasped. A shadow pulled me underground. His uniform was torn, hands scratched raw, but there were no tunnels, no holes. What shadow? Chai demanded. Boone just stared, eyes hollow. It knew my name. That afternoon, they found a clearing that shouldn't have been there, a circle of bare earth, ringed by stones carved with the same symbols from the outpost. In the center, a pile of bones, human and animal, bleached white. Lek kicked one, then froze as a laugh high and guttural echoed from the trees. Enough games, Crit yelled, firing a burst into the canopy. The laughter stopped, but the air grew colder. Night fell like a curtain. The squad huddled around the fire, rifles ready. Then the apparitions came, soldiers in tattered uniforms, Thai and Burmese, their faces rotting, marching silently through the camp. Somchai sobbed, Lek cursed, and Chai fired warning shots that passed through them like smoke. The figures faded, but the message was clear. They weren't alone. At midnight, Boone screamed and ran into the jungle. They chased him, flashlights cutting through the dark, until they found him clawing at a tree, babbling about eyes in the roots. The tree bled when Chai touched it, a thick red sap that stank of death. They dragged Boone back, tying him to keep him still. The whispers became screams, and the ground trembled. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. The final day broke with a blood-red sunrise. The squad was unraveling. Somchai prayed nonstop. Lek's jokes turned to mutters. Boone rocked silently, and Crit's orders grew frantic. Chai felt it too. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was angry. They had one goal: reach the extraction point, 6 kilometers away. The trail twisted impossibly, looping back to the bone circle. The stones pulsed now, glowing faintly. The whispers formed words. Steppe shadows stretched from the trees, humanoid but wrong, limbs too long, heads cocked unnaturally. Chai fired, and they scattered, only to reform. Midday, the entity revealed itself. A figure rose from the earth, tall, cloaked in darkness, its face a shifting mass of eyes and mouths. It spoke in a voice that rattled their bones. This land is mine. Your blood feeds it. Crit charged, emptying his magazine into it. The bullets dissolved, and the figure laughed, flinging Crit into a tree with a sickening crunch. He didn't get up. Panic took over. Somchai bolted, vanishing into the jungle with a scream. Lek froze, muttering apologies as the shadows tore him apart, piece by piece. Boone stood, eerily calm, and walked toward the entity, whispering, "I hear you." He collapsed, lifeless, as if drained. Chai was alone. The entity loomed, its eyes boring into him. Memories flooded his mind, wars, massacres, bodies piled along the border. This thing was old, born of bloodshed, tethered to the land. One must stay, it hissed. Chai ran, legs burning, the extraction point a faint hope. The jungle clawed at him, roots tripping, vines snaring. Behind, the entity's laughter grew fainter. He stumbled into the open as the chopper landed, collapsing aboard. The pilot didn't ask questions. As they lifted off, Chai looked down. The jungle stared back, thousands of eyes glinting in the trees. He survived, but the whispers followed him home, a debt unpaid.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.